Furnishings for this program provided by Van Tassel's Fireside Furniture and Clock Gallery, 5000 Kilgore, Muncie, Indiana.
The annual Ball State University Fund Drive is underway, and this year's co-chairpersons are Garfield cartoonist Jim Davis and his wife Carolyn, both Ball State graduates. And Jim, with your busy schedule, I'm going to ask why you became involved in a big project like this.
Well, because I've been involved with Ball State since, well, I came to Ball State in 1963, so I've been around Ball State or in the Ball State community for over 21 years. Carolyn came to Ball State in 1965, so she's been here nearly 20 years. And I frankly feel that a lot of Garfield's growth, maturity, resulted as from my association with Ball State from college days and working, learning, growing in the Muncie community. And I think Ball State's as much a part of Garfield as Garfield is of Ball State. And quite frankly, Carolyn and Garfield and I feel indebted to Ball State and the Muncie community for that.
Good. You have good memories of your university years.
Oh, very much so.
Good.
Yes, we enjoy it.
We might mention that Garfield is honorary chairman.
Yes, he is.
Tell us about the campaign. Do you have a goal as such?
No firm goal is established. Obviously, we would love to top last year's campaign. We'd like to keep it growing. We think with Garfield's involvement, because of his name, because of his national reputation, we can bring the annual fund to more people than has happened so far. Last year's campaign, though, was a great success. It broke all records. Last year, I think the annual fund raised over $3 million. By the way, $1,577,000 was raised right here in Delaware County, so it was a highly successful campaign. The President's Club grew from grew about 15%, from 230 to 265 members. It was very successful. I think this year, with the momentum that James Parks built last year, and with Garfield's involvement, we can be even more successful than that.
What happens to the money?
The money goes into the Ball State fund, and then it depends on the fund. Sometimes they can be restricted to a particular campaign. Let's say if a donor has a specific interest. It could be University Singers, Cardinal Varsity Club. It can go to a specific department. The fund likes to see those unrestricted dollars come in, however, to go for scholarships, to go for those things that the university vitally needs. So the money can go virtually anywhere a donor would like to see, or it can be unrestricted, as I said. This year, Carolyn, Garfield, and I are very interested in seeing some money go to a new alumni facility. Right now, the alumni building is right on the campus. We foresee, as well as Ed Shipley, who's director of the fund, perhaps an alumni facility that can be big, new, beautiful, some place to bring the alumni for campus occasions, some place to entertain people, some place where we can have a good meal or sit around and visit or learn more about the university, to have some place to spend before or after a basketball game or football game, some place where we can have new offices, maybe some place where Garfield can reside too. Some kind of a facility that from now on we can set apart to show Ball State for what it is, a nice show place to entertain alumni. And along that line, we have an incentive program for this year for any donors who give an additional gift on top of their regular gift of $100 or more. They will get a full-color, limited edition Garfield thank you poster that will be personally autographed. For a gift of $500 or more, they will receive an original drawing from myself of Garfield, thanking him for the donation. for a donation of $1,000 or more, they'll get the original drawing, a tour of the Garfield studio, and a dinner or luncheon with Carolyn and I. And I personally want to donate. I can't wait to have luncheon myself. And for a larger gift, why, Garfield will personally come to your neighborhood and rub out the dog of your choice.
He's getting totally involved, too.
Yes, he is.
It is a total involvement on your part.
Yes,
There's
it
a
is.
great deal of effort involved as chairman.
It's a nationwide campaign. From the regional telefunds, the Ball State tries to cover the entire country. And it is it's a rather complicated network as far as how the telefund operates, and the other funds as well, because it's basically in 4 parts. We have the campus campaign, which involves students, faculty, personnel, staff, whatever. And then the Cardinal Varsity Club, which obviously is for the athletics. And then the President's Club personal solicitation. Those are for annual donors of $100 or more. And then the regional telefunds that basically raise the bulk of the money for the annual fund. And so again, with Garfield's national reputation, we think we can point to Ball State and point to Garfield as basically a Ball State alumnus himself, and encourage people to donate who previously maybe have not considered it before.
You wonder what motivates people to donate, because Ball State has one of the most successful campaigns every year. We have one of the most successful campaigns for a small university in the country.
I think that's because of the personal involvement from the people that handle the annual funds. I think it's more active. I think it's very well organized, and that speaks well of the people at Ball State who are responsible for the fund, as well as hopefully the fund chairman year in and year out. Ball State, by virtue of its size, I think is a nice-sized university in that it's very personal. I don't think people felt as though they were just a number at a big university. Thereby, when they graduated from Ball State, they think of it as more a personal experience, a family experience, than just strictly an educational experience. I know that's the way I felt when I went to Ball State.
And therefore you feel a member, though you're a member of the family.
Mm-hmm. And they also like to, quite frankly, point with pride to those things that Ball State's done, or those people who have gone to Ball State. I'm sure people point to David Letterman or Joyce DeWitt or Garfield when they say they're from Ball State. That gives the university a place, a name, something to identify with, and that can't hurt.
That's true. What was your involvement as a student, yours and Carolyn's?
Carolyn was in a sorority. She was Chi Omega. She worked with the student orientation program and other organizations. She was a Ball State University singer. I was Theta Xi, worked in student government on the Interfraternity Council, was in Blue Key for a while in the honors program, and so I worked with a lot of the organizations.
We used some of your early drawings on one of our shows that you did for the sports department. and it showed a prototype of John, and
yes.
It was used for one of their projects.
I worked with Bud Getchell on a physical fitness book early on, right before I got syndicated, and we had a lot of fun with that project. And while at Ball State, I did occasionally do an editorial sketch for the newspaper, which at that time was a weekly newspaper.
I see. Now, what does Garfield think of the campaign?
Well, obviously he's flattered to be the chairman. His motto is, "I want you." We got him in an Uncle Sam position pointing out to the readers. And he thinks people should give, and give dearly, to the campaign. The more money, the better. Garfield does not have the tact. I find myself apologizing for Garfield more often than not. Just for sake of his own ego, he would love to see a very successful campaign because of his involvement with it. And he obviously will not physically be involved as much. He's got a lot of napping to do, a lot of eating to do, so that's why Carol and I have to get out and do a lot of the work for him.
But if they don't give, he might get them.
I wouldn't cross him.
Jim, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.
Jim Davis, who is this year's chairman, with his wife, Carolyn Davis, the Ball State Annual Fund Drive. Dr. Bruce Kuniholm, assistant professor of public Policy Studies at Duke University and member of the policy planning staff of the Department of State, recently spoke at Ball State University. We talked to him about the Middle East. Dr. Kuniholm, what do you see in the bombings that occurred in Kuwait yesterday?
To begin with, I must say that the first thing I've seen is television this morning, and that's very limited. But if I were to speculate on it, it seems to me that the source of the bombing, if the suggestions are correct in saying that they ultimately come from Iran or they're Iranian supported, is that Khomeini really intends to spread the revolution. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why Saddam Hussein attacked Iran to begin with, one of many. And it may be in part a retaliation against the forces of Western imperialism, however he wants to characterize the West, because my understanding is the bombings in Kuwait were both against the American embassy and the French embassy and a number of other places. And as you recall, the bombing of the Marines or the terrorist attack on the Marines in Beirut also occurred simultaneously with an attack on the French. And the Iranians are apparently very upset with what they perceive as being Western support for the Iraqis in the Iran-Iraq war. And I don't know if you'd like me to go into the dynamics of that war and how that may be related, but I'd be glad to do so.
Indeed.
My understanding of the problem in the Iran-Iraq war right now is that Iran intends to see this to the very end. Saddam Hussein is the goal which Khomeini has said, or the elimination of Saddam Hussein is what Khomeini wants. And right now, Iraq is in very difficult straits because the war is costing them approximately $1.5 billion a month. They are getting less than $1 billion, some say around $600 million from the Gulf states. And because of this economic crunch, Iraq has gotten desperate and has begun attempting to bomb Iranian vessels going to Kharg Island and supplying Iran. One of the things that's kept Saddam going is Gulf money. And in order to continue getting Gulf money, he has periodically warned that he would attack Kharg Island, where about 2 million barrels of oil a day are exported from Iran. Now, were he to bomb Kharg, and experts disagree on whether it would be effective in eliminating or creating enough problems so that Iran couldn't export oil, were he to do that, the Iranians would probably retaliate. They would not retaliate against Iraq. They might very well retaliate against the Gulf states, which is one of the reasons why they continue to finance Iraq. They're also dreadfully worried about the export of the revolution. I was in the Gulf this last spring, and when I was there, many of the people were concerned that Khomeini's revolution had not died, and in fact some of the Shia elements within various states, for example, the several hundred thousand Shia in Saudi Arabia, half of Bahrain's population, and the sizable and in fact majority population of Shia in Iraq, all would be responsive to Khomeini, not necessarily because they supported him so much as in many cases they opposed regimes that did not represent their interests. And to the extent that they were seen as corrupt or not representative, then they were more responsive to the kind of ideology propounded by Khomeini. And I think the terrorist attacks, to get back to the question that you raised, are in part focused on the forces as perceived in Iran of Western imperialism. And I think that that's what those are designed to project.
President Assad of Syria and Premier Khomeini are both frail men in poor health. What would the death of either one or both of these men do to the situation?
Well, let me say something about Khomeini. When I was in the State Department, we all thought that Khomeini would die in 6 months, and we kept waiting, and it didn't happen. And you may know that he has a brother who's 15 years older than he. And when I was in the Gulf, the story going around was that he had a sister who was 20 years older who had died, and that when she did, her parents were extremely upset. And so the point was that if you're waiting for him to die, you may wait a very long time. And unfortunately, I suspect that the death of Khomeini is going to be necessary before there will be any modus vivendi in the Iran-Iraq war. Khomeini hates Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was the one who threw him out of Iraq in 1978. It's a personal issue. Khomeini has never compromised with anybody on anything. He's extremely adamant, and he's been successful precisely because he's been adamant. So I would say that since he's made Saddam Hussein the issue and since they've lost so many lives, I doubt that until he goes, much can be done. People have tried through the non-aligned movement, you name it, they haven't worked it out. And even if Saddam Hussein were to die, I don't think Khomeini would compromise. It's not clear. Now, the death of Assad is a different issue. As I understand it, no one is clear what's wrong with him. They said an appendectomy. It's taken a long time for him to recover, and sources in Britain say that it may be far worse. If he goes, it's not clear what happens. I think he runs Syria with an iron fist. He's had no problem in killing sizable elements of the Syrian population in Hama, for example. And were he to go, whether his brother would take over and be able to manage it with the same capacity, I don't know. Many people say that Assad may very well be the most able leader in the Middle East. They may not like him very much, but they all acknowledge that he's extremely able. If you read Kissinger's memoirs, Kissinger acknowledges that he's not only able, but very tough and very effective.
Is he not behind most of the problems in Lebanon?
He's behind a lot of them, but I think it has to be looked at in a different context. I guess I would disagree with the administration in the sense that I don't think the issue in Lebanon is a U.S.-Soviet rivalry. I think the issue in Lebanon is in part that other powers contiguous to Lebanon, particularly Syria and Israel, have important interests that have to be acknowledged and met. Israel's have been because they forced the issue. I think Syria's were not. Assad was not included in the Reagan plan. His interests were not included when Israel made its agreement with Lebanon. And I think his support for the Druze and Shia elements in Lebanon was in part because he wanted his interests addressed. And so when you talk about the issue in Lebanon, the administration puts it on a U.S.-Soviet basis. I'd put it on an Israeli-Syrian basis, and I think that ultimately the only possible solution in Lebanon will come about when you can have withdrawal based on the fact that both Syrian and Israeli security interests have been dealt with, and then you can have Lebanon for the Lebanese. I don't know if you want to pursue your question or...
Well, wasn't there an agreement that the Israelis would withdraw if the Syrians withdraw? Was it as simple as that?
Well, it was as simple as that, but it needs to be elaborated upon. The Syrians agreed that they would get out if they were asked to by the Lebanese government. The Lebanese government has asked them to get out. However, the Syrians have been unwilling. And so what it really gets down to is Assad feels that he's got security concerns in Lebanon that have to be addressed that were not addressed. Needless to say, that's the very reason why Israel invaded Lebanon. When they attacked Lebanon, I think there had not been but one terrorist attack in the previous 10 months from Lebanon, and that occurred when the Israelis had bombed Lebanon. And they used as a pretext for their invasion the attempted assassination of Argoff in London by a supposed PLO element, which was in fact an element opposed to Arafat and the PLO. Now the question then was, why did Israel do that? And the answer was because it had security concerns, long-range security concerns, that they felt needed to be addressed. You could make the argument that Assad feels the same way about Syria's concerns and refuses to withdraw for that very reason. We may not like it. We may use international legal problems as a context for condemning him, and perhaps appropriately so.
As an expert on the Middle East and its problems, are you concerned with our involvement?
Terribly concerned. I mentioned to you before that I had been a Marine, an officer back in the late 60s and early 70s, and I have enormous concern for the deployment of American troops, sometimes in a context where it's not clear what their mission is. And it seems to me that the administration now intends to get the Marines out by June with something that approximates Vietnamization that we had in Vietnam, and that is Lebanization of the war. Supposedly we're going to support the Lebanese army to a point where they can take control over the problems right now being taken care of by the American Marines. However, right now what they're really doing is serving as a symbolic show of force, and it's not clear that they're doing anything. They're sizable enough to get in trouble, not so sizable that they can really do anything.
David Tambo is head of the Special Collections at Ball State University Bracken Library. And the University Library has been very lucky to recently receive some very fine material from the Elisabeth Ball estate. David, you brought a few pieces with you. How many in the collection that were given to the university?
Several hundred items, as a matter of fact. One segment of the collection is a series of several hundred posters, and then there are other materials of the format that you see here, various books, pamphlets, and so on.
And what we're looking at are 3 extremely rare books, are we not?
That's right.
Let's take a look at this for you. And I'm sure that everyone in the audience would recognize Poor Richard's Almanac, published by Benjamin Franklin.
I hope so. That's why I brought that, among other items.
For some reason, I thought it was larger in size. It was just a very small publication.
Mm-hmm.
This is maybe, what, 5 by 6 inches?
Yeah, I would say probably no bigger than that.
And this is quite a rare and valuable piece.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, what you're looking at is a 1735 edition, and there are really 3 copies of this that exist.
And this is one of 3?
And this is one of 3.
Oh, my. Now, I wonder why. I noticed there's a little leather stamp that's been placed on the inside cover of the case, which is very beautifully done, and obviously made especially to hold this. And yet that is also placed on the almanac itself, and it appears to be from somebody's library collection, CFH.
That's normally what this would indicate, but at this stage we don't really know whose library that would have come from.
And isn't it too bad that they would put it on the document itself?
Well, it is, yes. We normally would not do this sort of thing, at least in archival circles and in rare book circles.
Would you consider removing it?
We wouldn't do the removal ourselves if it was to be removed. This would be the kind of a job that a professional conservator would do.
But that's something that might be considered.
It might be considered, but one would have to gauge what the potential damage would be.
Right, and what, how it would affect the historical value.
Certainly.
Okay. Next we go to a very lovely and extremely rare book. Tell us about this one.
What you're looking at there is a late 16th century illuminated manuscript, and this would be of the time period when many books, of course, printing was just coming into being in that century, and this would have literally been hand-lettered and painted.
I'm looking for one of the, here we are.
Notice the gold gilt on there, as well as the other hand-painted figures.
Is it a religious text?
It is. This is a Catholic breviary, which really relates mostly to the Christmas period in terms of the religious cycle.
Weren't most of the books done by religious personages?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. There's monks and nuns and...
Well, I think that has something to do with the educational level at that time and what people in the Middle Ages received education and in fact would have been literate.
And how rare would you catalog this book?
This is an extremely rare book, and it's just by the virtue of its name, an illuminated manuscript. It's a one-of-a-kind item.
How beautifully they decorated the sides of the pages. I think we have cherries and leaves on that side. Now this book is lovely. In fact, it's encrusted on the cover with semi-precious stones.
It is. This is a Keats volume of poetry dating back to the 1820s. As I recall, there are something like 40 turquoise and 5 amethyst stones on the cover of this volume.
And look on the inside cover. Isn't that lovely? That's a watercolor.
It's a miniature portrait of Keats himself.
And it is, of course, the original publication.
First edition.
Did he sign it?
I don't believe that he did. Well, we'll have to check.
They were signed. I thought because of the original watercolor, it might have special significance. Given to a friend or...
That's one of the things we don't have is extensive documentation as to how these volumes actually passed through generations through the years.
And this was printed in 1820.
Right.
And I'd like to show how beautifully preserved the book fits into a velvet case, which closes thus and beautifully preserves the book.
That's right.
What are some of the other books and material that you received?
Well, as I mentioned already, I guess, there are several hundred posters, which for obvious reasons were a little more difficult to bring here. And
posters?
Relating primarily to the period around World War I, early 20th century.
Do you know why there was an interest on the part of Miss Ball in the World War I posters?
I'm not precisely sure. One of the interesting things about this particular collection that comes to us is that it's not just a collection of Elisabeth Ball's, but was in fact begun by her father, George Ball. So a number of the items go back to the period when he was actually collecting materials.
Yeah, it's too bad that there was not some record made of acquisition, and I suppose there was to some extent, but if you knew a little about the background and the acquiring.
That's always, it's always an interesting and important thing to have, establishing what we would call the provenance of the item itself and how it's passed from hand to hand.
What other things do we have in the way of books? Not only books, but I understand also there was a collection of autographs of signers of the Declaration of Independence.
That's right. That's another one of the significant elements of this collection. What we have are 48 of 56 signatures mounted on a chart, which are signatures of the various signers of the Declaration.
I see. And there were how many signers originally?
56.
56, and we have 48 of the 56.
That's right, an almost complete set.
Do we have Button Gwinnett?
No, that's one of the rare signatures, and that is not included.
You know, from my school days, I can remember Button Gwinnett's signature being so desirable and rare. You wonder why a man of his prominence didn't sign his name more frequently.
Well, one of the things, as an indirect answer, one of the things that we'll be doing later this year is having an exhibit in Special Collections which will highlight the signers of the Declaration and give little biographical vignettes of the different signers that we have in our collection. So you get an idea of who these people really were.
And what they did. Some were farmers, were they not? And some were merchants. Some were wealthy and some were not.
That's right.
A good cross-section of early America. Good. Will you have an Elisabeth Ball exhibit? We
will. Even before we take on a larger scale exhibit, we will on a more individual basis highlight some of the finer items that are in the collection.
Is the material available to scholars for study?
Certainly. And in fact, that's the main reason for our Special Collections being in existence, is not just to preserve, but to encourage use of our materials.
So it will be available.
Yes.
That's great. And we're very proud of the way you're building Special Collections at Ball State. We're getting a collection to be proud of.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thank you very much. David Tambo, who is head of Special Collections at Ball State University, our guest today, along with Jim Davis of Garfield fame. Thank you and have a good day. We'll be on camera.
Furnishings for this program provided by Van Tassel's Fireside Furniture and Clock Gallery, 5000 Kilgore, Muncie, Indiana.